This is a case of J.R.O. Griffiths, and just so you can get the full reference, I'll move the image down there a bit. Now, those of you who heard the introductory lecture I gave in June will remember that capital allowance cases did not usually come up that often. There seems to be a steady flow of them at the moment, and most of them tend to be for plant and machinery allowance claims. So we can get the most important type of capital allowance claim considered a lot by the tribunal. Now, the case is a fascinating insight into the manufacture of Walker's crisps. So if you just want to know a bit more about how Walkers operate, then I would suggest reading the decision, forgetting about all the boring tax bits. J.R.O. Griffiths was the principal supplier of crisping potatoes in the UK for Walker's crisps. And in order to secure that particular contract, what they have to do is to ensure that during the course of the year, there is a steady flow of potatoes available for Walkers to turn into crisps. In other words, it's J.R.O. Griffiths who have to store the potatoes for a long period and supply them to Walkers when Walkers needs them. Now, anyone who's grown potatoes will probably know there is a limited shelf life for potatoes, and there's a limited season. So if you're trying to supply potatoes to a crisp manufacturer with a steady supply throughout the year, you're going to have to do something rather clever in order to keep the potatoes in a good quality condition. And in fact, what Walkers do is they give you bonuses, which are quite considerable, in order to, if you have good quality potatoes, because if the potatoes come in and some of them have to be thrown out, that might be normal. But if you can actually reduce the number of rejects, you'll actually get a bonus from Walkers. And this bonus is effectively what keeps the J.R.O. Griffiths business alive. What it does is it puts the potatoes into a special form of storage facility, which is described as, to a layperson, the store looks from the outside like a commercial warehouse being covered in cladding panels on both sides and on the roof. So the revenue will no doubt look at a picture of the exterior of the building and say, this is a commercial warehouse. That does not qualify for plant and machinery allowances. However, there was complex ventilation and fanning machinery within the building, part of the building. It was temperature controlled. And I guess the closest case I can think of, it's probably the first case that sort of came up live in my own professional career on capital allowances, the Atwood and Anduff car wash case, where there was a dispute as to whether or not a drive-in car wash was all one piece of machinery, plant or machinery, or whether part of it was the premises of where the car washing took place. Now, what the tribunal noted is that the costs of the structure were about £300,000, and that compared with a cost of about £55,000 if it were a straightforward storage facility. In other words, 6 times the cost of the building was in order to accommodate all the special ventilation, fanning, and temperature controls within the storage facility. So the question is, was this plant or was this a building with a bit of equipment? And if it was held to be plant, was it also a building or structure? And that point was actually conceded by the taxpayer. They recognised it was either a building or a structure, probably a building. And the relevance of that is buildings and structures are technically excluded from qualifying for plant and machinery allowances unless they come within a list of exceptions known as List C, found in Section 23 of the Capital Allowances Act. As I said, that middle point was conceded by the taxpayer, probably quite rightly. So the first tier tribunal had two questions to address. First, did it get off the ground as plant? And then finally, did it get protected by inclusion within List C? So you can imagine the type of cases, we went through them back in June, which the parties would have listed as to whether or not something is plant or premises. HMRC in particular said this was just a setting rather than plant. The tribunal reached the conclusion that each item of machinery integrated into the store functions as part of the whole. The store is not the setting for the appellant's trade, but an integral part of how the appellant carries out its qualifying activity. In other words, it was more than a building with equipment in. It was effectively equipment itself. And this was probably helped by the fact of how the air ventilation worked, which kept the temperature controlled. So as far as the first tier tribunal was concerned, it was plant. So we then had to look to see whether or not, having been potentially excluded by sections 21 or 22, whether or not the case fell within List C. Now, List C has a number of exclusions, and these exclusions were effectively a reflection of case law up to 1994, when all these restrictions were introduced into the legislation. So what the Revenue did was they said, okay, or Parliament did, we don't like the case law so far, but we're going to accept it, but we're going to ensure that there is no further erosion of the definition of plant or machinery. So there's a list of exclusions, or inclusions, depending which way you want to look at it, known as List C now. Item 18 is cold stores. Item 28 is the provision of silos provided for temporary storage. Don't need to worry about storage tanks. Now, item 28 was based upon a 1974 case called Schofield. Schofield is the authority that grain silos by the docks are plant or machinery, and therefore one can claim plant and machinery allowances on it. And it was the case of Schofield that led in 1994, so 20 years later, to the statutory inclusion of item 28 for silos. Now, the facts of the Schofield case involved silos storing grain, and the grain was stored there for about 7 days. And what the Revenue tried to do was to say, well, we've got to follow the facts of Schofield. We can't just allow any silos to be treated as plant and machinery. We've got to be much closer to the facts of Schofield. So the first thing HMRC tried to do was saying, well, that was grain, these are potatoes. Well, the first tier tribunals said, we do not accept HMRC's attempts to distinguish the type of crop being stored. So there was no justification for that. The Revenue tried to back up their argument by looking at the definition of silo from the Oxford English Dictionary, and it talks about the storage of grain, etc. And what the Revenue tried to do was to say, well, the OED says it's got to be the storage of grain. However, the tribunal said, well, particularly since the definition uses the word etc., it means that the list of crops given in the OED definition is not exhaustive. The Revenue tried again following the Schofield approach and said, well, how about temporary? Some of these potatoes are stored for up to 9 months. Schofield shows that temporary means 7 days or less. Well, again, the first tier was not happy with that particular part of the argument and said, as Parliament intended such a result, it could have imposed a clear definition, for example, defining temporary storage as being periods up to 7 days. It did not do so, and in our view, such a limitation cannot be read into the legislation. Furthermore, we do not accept a short period such as 7 days to be a natural reading of temporary. So the first tier said it came within item 28. As it came within item 28, they didn't need to consider item 18, but they did so for good measure. And I think on this point, I can certainly see why the revenue might have had a bit more success. But what the first tier tribunal said was the potatoes are cooled on being put into storage primarily by the operation of the walls functioning as radiators, dispersing the heat and the air being blown through the crop. Having done so, the purpose of the store is to maintain the ideal temperature to enable the potatoes to be stored for their condition to be maintained. However, it is necessary for these purposes that the potatoes are stored between 6.5 and 11.5 degrees, depending on the variety. In our view, that is sufficiently cold. Now, of course, if the hearing was taking place in the summer, between 6.5 and 11.5 degrees, which I assume to be Celsius, is sufficiently cold. But in the winter, 6.5 degrees to 11.5 degrees is potentially mild. I'm wondering whether or not the concept of cold storage implies temperatures of fridge temperature of 4 degrees or less. I don't know. Were this case to go to the upper tribunal on this particular point, the upper tribunal might take a different view as to what cold means. On the other hand, they might say, ultimately, it is for the first tier tribunal, which finds the facts, to take a view, and they might not interfere. This is one of those cases which could be on the cusp of, is it an appealable point or not? However, I'm not sure the case will go to the upper tribunal, because I think that the case is sufficiently clear on the first point that it is plant, and item 28, it is a silo. And therefore, I think it would be unwise for the revenue to waste more taxpayers' money to prove a point that I think is clear in any event.